Chapter 8. A Bell Ringing for War. "You do realize the problem with this plan," spoke the very skeptical voice of Weiss Schnee, a hushed speech somewhere in between a shout and a whisper. "There's just one," Demon countered, earning a sigh from the Schnee and a kick in the shin from Neo, who was sitting next to him. The three of them were sitting calmly on the open deck of the medium-sized boat setting its sail for Menagerie, the same boat that Blake had apparently traveled on as well. After Neo's tip-off about a captain who had apparently seen her, Demon confirmed that fact after finding the only ship that was actually keen enough to sail in these times, where they couldn't even call for help thanks to the CCT network being cut off. They had bought tickets on one of the less booked trips, where it was almost only them, and one other guy who had traveled with them, although they never did meet the supposed other person who was with them. It took almost the entire trip for Demon to recover from the special way that Weiss dealt with his explanation as to why Neo was here, namely a knee to his nether regions. The stupid thing was that she accepted this explanation, but did it anyway. He would never understand women. The two weren't exactly on the best of terms, but they were no longer trying to kill each other, which was good. The main topic of conversation they were now having was on exactly what would happen once they got to Menagerie, something Demon honestly hadn't thought of until now. He thought it would take a lot longer to break into the SDC headquarters, so he figured he would just come up with it afterwards, which he did, but it wasn't exactly that well thought through. "I was referring to the one factor you didn't take into account during your plan," Weiss argued, crossing her arms while fixing him with another one of her signature death glares. Demon had forgone his usual armor, thanks to the fact that the White Fang presence here was a hell of a lot more, thanks to it being an island populated almost entirely by Faunus, and that they had all been briefed to kill him on sight. He wore a baggy pair of khaki pants and found a regular black t-shirt, a pair of sunglasses, and a scarf covered his head, his hair tied up in a warrior's braid. He had opted to leave on his left gauntlet as it contained most of his stuff and had his network hacking devices, as well as the fact that he could hide his knife on the underside so it wouldn't flash around whenever he walked. Another spare knife was kept strapped to his shin, as well as his wingman on the opposite leg. He had also made sure to bring Wilt, the blade being wrapped in black linen and strapped to his back. Neo had decided to disguise herself as well, being that she had worked with the White Fang for some time as well, so she had brought along a bunch of clothes that she had used to disguise herself during the Vital Festival, having twin tails, as she called them, as well as having a completely different outfit. Weiss, on the other hand, well, she didn't really think to bring any other clothes than the ones she needed, so she wasn't exactly going to turn out well at all, considering they need to try and hide the fact that she was a Schnee from an entire island of Faunus. "You could always dye your hair," Demon suggested, earning an even more threatening scowl. Apparently, Weiss was as fond of her hair as Yang. "Well, other than that, we needed a serious wardrobe change, and we've got nothing to work with, so there's only one option." He turned to Neo, who had gotten the general gist, focusing hard for a moment before blinking a couple of times and nodding to say that it was done. When they looked back to Weiss, it wasn't a Schnee that they were looking at now. Neo had managed to cast an illusion that made her look a little like RWBY, to be honest, with a black combat skirt, full-length black stockings, while keeping her white boots. Her hair was pulled out of its typical ponytail and was covering one eye, a few specks of white coloring at the edges of her hair that went down just above her chest. Her body was covered in a black sleeveless jacket that left her arms exposed, the same pale skin they had come to expect from her. "Well, I think that solves that problem," he said, clapping his hands together, getting off the seat and walking over to the railing, trying to see how far from the island they were. "What do you mean, solves the problem?" Weiss cried, almost jumping out of her skin when she looked down at herself. She quickly went to the nearest mirror-like surface, which so happened to be one of the portholes, and began looking herself over. She took a minute or so to look over the finer details of her clothing, but eventually came back with a small smile on her face and thanked Neo. There's still the issue of your terrible plan, she remembered, not liking the amount of time he put into its formulation. Well, it's simple enough. We stay around here for some time, see what we can hear or find out. Then we go and see her to check it out and convince her to come back. You really think she wants to come back? You did. I wanted to come back. I didn't really have a choice when I left. She decided to leave Vale behind. Well, then we'll make sure she has a reason to come back. It can't be that hard. This is Blake we're talking about. It took me nearly 2 weeks before I actually had a conversation with her that lasted for more than 4 seconds. Demon tried to come up with an argument against it, realizing a startling fact in the process as well. He had only ever really talked to Blake for what would probably accumulate to a total of 5 minutes. Whenever he talked to her, it was either on school break, where he just asked what she was doing, or to ask if she was coming to lunch with the rest of them. The longest he'd ever talked to her was when he asked for any book suggestions she could give, and she went into a rather lengthy rant on the type he'd want. And then again, it was Blake's version of a lengthy rant. We'll burn that bridge when we come to it, okay? I'm pretty sure it's cross that bridge when we come to it, she corrected, earning a laugh from Demon. He didn't reply as the boat began its docking procedure, and the trio made their way to the bottom decks, where the gangplank was being put down. Waiting on the lowest deck was Cerberus, the bike being tied down to stop it from moving around, which was quickly righted as one of the deckhands ripped them off. Why did you bring that death trap? Weiss questioned, not at all remembering if they had actually put it on the boat. Demon, in truth, brought it along because he needed something to carry his gear, which was currently stuffed inside a satchel on the back of the bike. I'm not leaving my baby behind, defended Demon, going over and beginning to wheel the motorcycle down the gangplank. The others followed closely behind. He swore that Weiss almost had a heart attack when she saw the sheer number of faunists that were walking around the dock, as well as the quaint and lively markets that were just off the seaport. Neo skipped happily along and jumped on Cerberus while Demon wheeled it over to one of the massive dry docks that dotted the port, walking straight towards a man who was laying back happily on one of the walls with a pipe in his mouth and an eye patch over his left eye, a navy trench coat covering his body. A few scales covered his cheeks. I take it you know your way around here, asked Demon when the man finally saw them coming over. The man let out a small smile and took a long drag from his pipe before replying, having a rather funny accent that Demon almost laughed at, his accent making him sound like a pirate. Aye, lad. I got a bit more brains on me for the place. I was wondering if you could direct me to a spare warehouse. I need a place to stay while I'm here, and I'm a bit short on Lien, Demon questioned, stopping a few feet from the man while cracking an even bigger smile. I reckon I have the one for you right here. The man took a moment to kick off the wall and stand straight, pulling a cane out of nowhere and using it to walk along the dock, beckoning the others to follow. Neo happily skipped off after him, while Demon turned to see Weiss looking far from her comfort zone, and casually stepping away from anyone else that happened to be walking by. You do realize that no one here is going to recognize you, he consoled, Weiss flinching significantly when she realized he was talking to her. I know, it's just, I don't exactly know how, safe this place is. Well, it's going to be a hell of a lot worse if you look shifty. I can't help it. Well, you better put your shit together because you can't exactly walk around like someone's trying to kill you every second. They would be if they knew who I was, she whisper-shouted, drawing the attention of a few passers-bys. She quieted down and took a deep breath, turning her head around and walking off after Neo, leaving Demon to sigh and follow while wheeling Cerberus along. They walked for a while until the guy stopped in front of an old-looking dry dock that was boarded up and looked about ready to fall down. He reached up with the end of his cane and hit one of the boards, kicking the door in afterward and stepping to the side as birds squawked and flew out in panic, knocking a few more boards down in the process. He gestured inside, ignoring the look of extreme skepticism that Weiss gave, smiling to himself in self-assurance. I'm not exactly complaining, But how long ago was this last opened? He asked, putting the stock on his bike and walking to inspect the insides. I ain't got any idea about that. Well, thanks then. I should probably pay you a bit for your services. He took out a 20 lien note, and the sailor happily tipped his hat, stuffing the money in his coat, walking back to where he was before and resting his back against the same wall, puffing out his pipe contentedly. With a slight hesitation, Demon took out a torch from his satchel on Cerberus and walked inside, seeing just what they were working with, and was, unsurprisingly, underwhelmed. Even from the look on the outside. The small dry dock had a small fishing boat. They had a massive hole in the hull, sitting on the struts, while two catwalks ran along both sides of the area behind the boat, where a large number of crates and fish nets were stacked haphazardly around. The catwalks were made of wood that was rotting apart from a few boards, and he doubted if he'd ever be able to get Cerberus across, while the area at the back was at least concreted, which lifted his hopes a tiny bit. Looks like we're going to be roughing it until we find Blake, Demon announced as he came back, getting slapped immediately across the face by both girls as they heard him. We are not sleeping in there, Weiss argued, not noticing that she had actually included Neo for the first time. The ice cream assassin actually agreed, and both of them stared at him, boring holes into his head with their death glares. What is it with women and death stares these days? Continues death stare. Fine, I'll pay for a hotel or something. Weiss huffed and cut her stare. Neo nodded in agreement and jumped back onto Cerberus as Demon tried to wheel it back to the dry dock. Several cracked floorboards later, and he managed to wheel it through to the back of the dock without it falling completely through, and the trio was now in the job of trying to find a place to stay while they were here. They got a few weird looks thanks to their clothing, but they were otherwise unnoticed as they made their way through town. Weiss continuously shifting nervously away when someone came too close, much to Demon's chagrin, all the way up until they arrived at the place they would be staying. Here we are, the Smiling Bayo, Demon announced, stopping in front of the building. The other two stopped next to him as well, and their ears nearly broke from Weiss's shouting. We are not staying here, she screamed, right in his ear, something that no one else seemed to notice. What is wrong with it? He countered, gesturing to where they were. It was a relatively small building in terms of the buildings that were in Vale, but it was definitely more rustic than anything they'd seen back there. It resembled something he'd expect from Japan, or something like that, with large sliding doors and flayed tiling on the roof, small windows showing inside the building, which revealed that the ground floor was a bar by the looks of it, while a sign outside let them know that it also had beds for rent. Well, for one, it looks like the place would attract Yang-like people. Is that the best excuse you have? Plus, I doubt it'll have 3 separate rooms because I'm not sleeping with you or the assassin. 3 minutes later. And here are your room keys for 3 single rooms. The clerk at the desk happily chimed, handing over 3 key rings to Demon, who was happy to take them, tipped her, and then walked back to where the other 2 were sitting at the table at the edges of the bar, as far away as Weiss could possibly get. What were you saying, Snow Angel? He jeered, as he slammed the keys on the table, as well as 2 beers, one with a scoop of ice cream and a glass of water, the former being for him and Neo, while Weiss voted to continue her trend of innocence and take some water. Said girl huffed in response to his antics and took the water, inspecting it as though it might have poison in it, then took a small sip to test. Now that we have a place to stay, how are we actually going to find Blake? Weiss questioned, continuing to lazily sip her drink. Weiss, we're literally in a bar. Info Gathering 101. Everyone knows everything at a bar. That's not true. Fine then. I'll go and find where Blake is while you sit here and hope some random doesn't notice you and sick the entire island on you. That'd be a good idea if it wasn't already sundown, she pointed out, Demon turned to see the street outside. You do realize that's when the bar just gets started, right? Countered the pilot, seeing Weiss facepalm before mumbling something and taking her keys and walking off to the stairs to the next level. With a sigh, Demon pulled his scarf down and began drinking his beer, managing to get rid of the entire cup of liquid within a few minutes of silent drinking. Neo sipped her own brew as she stared at something out the window. Once he was finished, Demon took his own room key and shoved it in his pocket, taking out his wallet in the process and looking at the meager amount of cash he had left after buying the drinks and the rooms for 3 nights. He took out a few bills and passed them off to Neo, who could only stare at the money as he held it out. "What's wrong? Never been handed money before?" He joked, his eyes going wide when she actually nodded in question, looking down sullenly into her half-finished drink. "Oh, I'm sorry." She smiled at him and took another sip from her drink, still not taking the money. "Well, consider this your first legitimate allowance. This money is 100% yours, and you don't have to spend it on anything if you don't want to. Go and buy whatever you want." Neo's own eyes went wide, and she hesitantly took the small wad of cash, looking through it and feeling as if it was the first time she'd ever touched money. With a slight tear in her eye, she happily jumped up and hugged him before quickly running out of the club and out into the night of menagerie, without so much as leaving a note as to say what she was doing. Demon took the initiative and drank the rest of her beer before handing all the glasses back to the bartender and looking around the bar for someone who looked well-informed, before he set his eyes on someone that brought him back to sudden reality. A few Mofaunus were sitting at the back, hidden by a broken light, with very recognizable symbols on their clothes. It was the White Fang. He became tense for a second before remembering he changed his getup for that exact reason. But he was more worried for Neo. Cinder might have ratted out her past accomplice and brought photos of her tournament getup so that she could be hunted down as well. He dismissed the thought and casually ordered another drink, taking it and walking nonchalantly over to the table near the White Fang grunts while trying to listen in on their conversation. No thanks to the obnoxious noise from the other patrons. He couldn't quite make out the words they were saying, cursing even more when the topic they were on was just chit-chat and nothing that would actually interest him. He was just about to consider giving up and leaving until a young woman came along, sitting next to the grunts and drawing all their gazes. She didn't look older than him in any way, yet she definitely held an air of authority around her, and the grunt's conversation dulled while she was there. She wore a black, plum, and navy-colored stealth suit that was sleeveless and cut off at her thighs. Gold zippers covered the suit that was anything but skin-tight, her feet covered in heavy combat boots that didn't seem at all fit to the rest of her outfit. Her brown hair was tied back in a curled ponytail, while her eyes were grayish light blue tint. The one thing that she didn't seem to have were any faunus traits, which he definitely found weird, until he saw small patches of scales dotted around her tan skin, that he guessed were from a reptile of some sort. One thing he definitely found weird was that none of them were wearing any masks, or anything flaunting their allegiance to the terrorist group, without repercussions. No one else at the bar seemed to care at all. He reached up to his ear with his gauntlet and activated the built-in microphone, hoping it would pick up exactly what was being discussed, hoping to do it without suspicion. He picked out what was being said through the thin din of the bar and smiled to himself when he heard what they were saying. "So you managed to confirm this?" came the hushed and slightly coarse voice of a young woman, directed straight at one of the men, who seemed to wither under her gaze. I don't know, ma'am. We were told to stake out the house until she showed up, but we haven't seen her come out yet." "So you just left?" "It's nighttime. I doubt she'd even do anything. She thinks she's safe right now, so she isn't leaving anytime soon." "You idiots. At least have the gall to report yourselves back to HQ," she hissed, standing up and beginning to leave. Inform the boss that I'm heading to the Belladonna household to complete what you failed to do. Don't fail us again. She quickly turned and took out a mask, placing it over her face and strutting out of the bar. Demon quickly chugged down the rest of his drink and followed her out as inconspicuously as he could. When he got outside, he swore to himself when he couldn't find her on the street at all. No one looked anything vaguely like the girl he'd seen. Yet when he looked up, he saw a dark green shadow jumping stealthily from tree to tree. He smiled to himself and began following them from the street, running as fast as he could without drawing any attention to himself, before he reached the area where there weren't as many people around. There was one thing that pilots were trained for that they had to excel in to prove efficient at all: parkour. And Demon was no exception, as he ran up the wall of the nearest house, grabbing onto the overhang before gravity could pull him down to the ground, pulling himself up and onto the roof in one smooth motion. After he was solidly on the roof, he looked around to try and find where the girl had run off to, catching a few trees shaking slightly in the line away from the house. He smiled to himself when he saw the shadow jumping between the natural towers and began chasing after her. He regretted not bringing his parkour kit, or at least having his grappling hook. But then again, there was a hell of a lot more parkour options he had open to him if he only used aura. One reason he hadn't tried to use his aura to boost his maneuverability is because his parkour kit would be extremely tripped out by any inhuman levels of speed and agility that aura allowed for. But now, he wasn't held down. Charging a small amount of aura into his legs, using a technique that Yang had told him about, he jumped up from the house and grabbed onto the nearest tree with his gauntleted fist, the claws on the fingers allowing him to dig into the tree with ease. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't exactly as nimble or as light as the girl he was tracking, and the tree began to bend under his weight. Quickly charging more energy into his legs, he began jumping from tree to tree, kicking off the second he touched it so that he wouldn't have to hold on, making for a reasonable jumping technique. It wasn't long before he was a short distance from the tree shaking ahead of him, and he quickly slowed his approach, grabbing onto the nearest tree with his gauntlets and cutting his momentum, as well as the tree. He fell to the ground, a small cry of surprise being muffled by the scarf over his mouth, managing to land on his feet and smiling to himself at his luck. That was until he looked up and remembered that there was a tree falling down. With a small creaking noise, the massive trunk sailed through the air towards the ground, and Demon held up his arms, preparing for the weight and trying to ready himself. His efforts were met with some success as the trunk landed perfectly in his arms and caused his limbs to buckle slightly under the weight, not breaking or even damaging them. He held it there for a few moments, reveling in how easy it was to hold up, until he began to feel the weight and bent his knees until it was close enough to the ground that he could place it down without much of a noise. Almost as soon as he placed it down, the girl he was tracking came to a stop outside of a house, and Demon's face blanched. It was the largest house on the entire island, and he didn't even need to look around to see that it was the center of town. And if the girl's words were anything to go off of, it was definitely Blake's. He carefully crouched low and began slowly making his way to the girl's position, right up until he was underneath her hiding place, so that she hadn't even seen him yet. He was just about to jump up and question her before he watched as her skin suddenly shifted to be as black as the night surrounding her, while he heard a commotion come from the house. Chameleon, huh? Two can play at that game. He quickly tapped one of the control buttons under his gauntlet, and the cloaking module he brought with him activated, coating his body and making it near impossible to see him. Albeit, the cloaking was as effective when he didn't have his helmet or pilot gear, but it was still effective, and combined with the fact that it was already sundown, he bet that his cloaking was better than the girl's chameleon skill. As he waited, his attention was drawn to the house, where he heard a massive slap. He turned to see who it was, and was relieved to see Blake slapping the monkey fauna he'd seen a couple of times around campus, mainly at the dance. Blake was wearing a new outfit that he swore was something Yang would have designed, and he conceded that she was at least not wearing her bow anymore. He stifled a laugh and waited out the performance, mainly of Blake giving shit to Sun, until the cat faunus knocked a scroll from Sun's hand and sent it flying into the trees, straight into the chameleon faunus above him. The girl above him hissed in pain as it impacted her, and both Sun and Blake turned to look at the noise. Their eyes narrowed as they managed to glimpse his target in her hiding spot. She also seemed to come to this revelation as Blake shouted, "A spy!" And the chameleon faunus jumped off the tree again. Blake running to the edge of her porch and jumped off after her. Demon watched as the other woman, who looked exceedingly similar to Blake, came out holding a tray of tea, cups, and a pot. Sun saying a quick few words before jumping off after the cat faunus and leaving the other woman standing there in confusion. Demon sighed to himself and jumped back up onto the tree canopy, seeing the white of Blake's outfit flitting through the trees above him, as well as the usual yellow blur of Sun. With another aura-charged tirade, he began jumping from tree to tree as fast as he could, deactivating his cloak to save power. While he was still ensuring he was trailing far enough behind that the three targets wouldn't notice him, the three in front of him finally veered out of the tree canopy and began running along the rooftops. Something which Demon smiled at as he followed them onto the roofs, ensuring he was far enough behind that they wouldn't notice, a recurring theme of his tracking. His queries stopped 2 rooftops ahead, and he quickly activated his cloak so that they wouldn't catch him, stopping stock still so that he would appear just as a slight shimmer. The spy he'd originally tracked had turned to face Blake, slicing a coolant pipe using some strange sword whip. The cat faunus simply dived through the mist and hissed at the spy. "Why were you watching me?" The chameleon faunus not bothering to respond as the two stared each other down. Just as he was about to move in to get a better vantage point, Sun had the great idea of flanking her, only to trip back to avoid a whip strike from her weapon. Blake took advantage of the distraction and kicked the scroll from the spy's hand. Demon almost thinking to shout out in annoyance for such an idiotic move on the spy's part. Granted, she did retaliate and kicked Blake back a short distance and was about to retrieve the scroll. She was stopped when she forgot about Sun and was tackled to the ground, a knee keeping her body down while he held her arms in place. After what happened next, Demon vowed to at least teach a couple of people he knew about restraining holds, meaning that they wouldn't have to be headbutted in the face and kicked off the next time they tried to hold someone down who was literally half their size. The spy was about to jump over to reach the scroll again, until Sun sent 4 bright yellow clones and tackled her to the floor, yelling for Blake to take the scroll. "Huh, that's new." Said cat faunus finally took the initiative and grabbed the scroll, just as Sun's aura ran out and his clones collapsed, releasing the spy from her prison for the 2nd time. "Is it seriously that hard to keep someone down for more than 5 seconds? "Watch out," called the monkey faunus. Blake turned to see the spy holding up her weapon once again, bearing witness to the white fang mask crumbling off after so much punishment, revealing the spy's face to the open. "Ilya," muttered Blake, as the 2 faunus stared each other down once again. Now he knew exactly what was going to happen. With both Blake and Sun unarmed, and no dust for Blake to use for an offensive assault, the spy could blitz through them both without much effort, unless he had anything to say about it. He began sprinting as fast as he possibly could, watching as Sun stood up and briefly remarked about how they must know each other. Seriously, is he saying this for himself or something? He parkoured over the broken coolant pipe and jumped the last few feet until he was just at the side of Sun, right as Ilya cracked a wicked strike of her whip, right at the guy's heart. With an almost practiced ease, Demon reached out and grabbed the whip, stopping it an inch from Sun's chest, leaving the other 3 frozen there like ghosts. Then he realized he still had his cloaking on. Deciding to be a bit more dramatic than he needed to be, he deactivated his cloak, not moving from where he stood, turning to the spy slowly. "Attacking an unarmed citizen of your own species? I didn't think the fang could sink any lower, but I stand corrected." Ilya growled with annoyance, and her skin turned a dark red as she pulsed electricity through her weapon, hoping to break his grip. Demon, on the other hand, almost laughed. He had made sure that when he had his armor repaired by Ivan, that he installed even more preposterous passive systems to give him an edge. One such being a coating that conducted electricity so well that it could be redirected straight towards the small reactor on his back. But without that there to stop it, his left gauntlet began sparking with its own electrical charge as it refused to go anywhere. He grimaced at the electricity shocking his body, and practically burned his arm with its intensity, although he still refused to drop it, as that would mean she would have her weapon back. He pushed through the pain and practically slammed the whip to the ground, slamming on it with his foot before taking out his knife and stabbing it between the links of the whip, far enough into the rooftop that it wouldn't move. "Thanks for the shock," he muttered as he neared, the faunus in front of him scowling as he moved closer. She made the first move and struck out with the left hook, hoping to catch him off guard. But all he did was dive under it and uppercut her jaw for the effort. The electricity stored within his gauntlet shocked her as much as the punch connected, and it was hit back until she was almost sliding off the building. Demon heavy enough of a heart to grab her leg before she fell off the side. Before she could right herself again, he punched her in the face with an open palm, knocking her out cold as her head impacted the metal roof, a small crack appearing in the cement. Demon lifted her up and expected his work, carefully placing her over his back limply and turning to face the other two faunus. "Hello again, Blake," he said happily, as recognition finally formed in the kitty's mind, not putting together the pieces until she got a good look at his gauntlet. "Demon?" she queried, not exactly sure if her guess was correct or not. He nodded happily. "Now, you don't have to slap me in the face any more than the last person, because Kieran Weiss already took care of that." Well, Demon had to admit, she didn't listen to him, although it wasn't exactly the way he wanted. A tear fell from her eye, and she marched forward and kicked him in the groin. He collapsed to the ground, groaning and holding the space between his legs, dropping the chameleon faunus as he did, muttering obscenities under his breath. "Why does Or not protect against this?" he shouted, rolling around in pain as Blake glared down at him with an evil stare. "I don't know, man, but it gets annoying sometimes," Sun replied nonchalantly. "Although I do have to ask, aren't you, supposed to be dead and all?" "Does it look like it?" "What are you doing here?" said Blake, standing over him with the same enraged glare. "Not some thanks or anything? Is this going to be the same thing as when I first met Yang?" She sighed heavily and helped him up, bringing him into an embrace before quickly stepping back to look at him. "You've certainly changed," she commented, gesturing to his outfit. "Nah, this is just my weekend get-up. I've got the rest of my armor back with the others." "The others?" "Weiss and Neo," Demon replied nonchalantly, using his spare time to walk back over and rip his knife from the ground, picking up Elia's weapon as well, clipping it to his side of his belt like a sword. "Weiss?" she hissed, eyes going wide. "You got her to come here?" "Technically, she was heading to Mistral, but I just took her on a little detour," he replied, not wanting to dwell on the fact that she'd ignored Neo. "Menagerie is a detour." "In truth, I'm here because we need Team RWBY back together," he replied, seeing Blake visibly flinch, turning away slightly as she gritted her teeth. "I came here because I'm done fighting. I'm done with the White Fang. I'm done with everything." "Well then, if you mean that, then I'm out," Demon said immediately, dropping Ilya's whip and walking off the edge of the roof. He knew exactly what Blake was doing right now, and he knew it all too well. He'd had several of his troops nearly give up during their first ever real battle, when they realized what they were doing finally hit them. He wasn't exactly one to stop and pause to try and comfort them until they sucked it up and stopped fighting altogether. So he always told them the harsh reality. If they didn't want to fight, then he let them. If they didn't want to kill for their cause, then they didn't need to. All they needed to know was that the enemy they fought wasn't going to know that they treated each soldier the same way when they gave up, with a bullet to the brain and a body bag. After they finally realized that, once they committed themselves, there was simply no simple way out. Walking away wasn't an option. So when he heard Blake go into the same self-denial, he knew that trying to comfort her and sugarcoat everything would have made her consider herself in the right, when all it was doing was putting her friends at risk more than she knew it. "Where are you going?" she almost shouted, making Demon turn and smile. "I thought you were done with everything. I came here to try and get back someone who would fight with me to take down Cinder and the ones responsible for the slaughter at Beacon. So, I'm going to go find someone who will understand what's going on." He was just about to jump down and head back to the bar, never intending to go that far, then smiled slightly when Blake quickly rushed to stop him. "Wait!" she nearly shouted, a slight look of desperation crossing her features as she held out her arm to stop him. "Yes," he replied, facing her with a slight smirk. She hissed a tiny bit when she realized what he'd done, but didn't back down, a new look of determination coming on. "I don't exactly know why there was a White Fang spy after me, so how about we see what we can get from her, and I'll think about it," she conceded, Sun's jaw dropping as he turned to Demon. "Seriously? You got her to agree to that in like 10 seconds when I've been here for days trying to do the same." "She was too focused on your abs to listen," teased Demon, getting hit in the side of the head by a furious Blake. He smiled to himself and picked the whip back up, ensuring to pick up Aaliyah's unconscious body and sling it back over his shoulder. The trio jumped down from the roof and began walking back to the Belladonna household, Blake not noticing the two guys fist bump when she wasn't looking. Just as they were about to walk in, Blake suddenly turned to Demon and grabbed him by the collar. "Did you say Neo?" she hissed, for what seemed like the 13th time that night, referring to their previous conversation. Said pilot shied back a bit and chuckled nervously, remembering how exactly this conversation went down with Weiss. "About that, it's a long story."